And on the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author of numerous books, including his latest, Understanding Socialism. The one just before that was Understanding Marxism, which we talked about last week. democracyatwork.info is his website, as well as rdwolff with two Fs.com. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff with two Fs. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So last week we were talking about how, we were talking about Marxism versus capitalism. I think that I'd like to dig into this a little bit more, along with your new book, Understanding Socialism. A lot of young people, particularly since the crash of 2008, are realizing that capitalism isn't the end-all and be-all, and also particularly since we're now almost 40 years into the Reaganomics experiment of extreme capitalism, of largely unregulated capitalism, and it's just devastating the workforce. I was just quoting earlier some new statistics from Brookings that 44% of all people in the workforce are earning full-time. People in the workforce are earning a median salary of $18,000 a year, which is just shocking. And so a lot of people are looking towards something else, and the word socialism gets kicked around a lot. And of course, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics used the word socialism. And so my question to you, I guess, is explain to us what actually has worked historically. I mean, we look at the quote, socialist experiment of the Soviet Union, and it seemed to have failed. We look at the, quote, socialist experiment of China, and they're on a path to surpass the United States, although, I'm not sure that most of us would want to live under a regime that has over 1 million people in prison camps. And then we look at, the countries of Northern Europe, particularly the Scandinavian countries, that call themselves socialist, and they have a higher quality of life, longer lifespan, better educational outcomes, better everything than we do here. But they have higher taxes, oh my God. And so what's what here?
Well, the question is great. There's no question that people are, in America, kind of coming out, I like to say, of a kind of hibernation like bears have. Ever since the Second World War and the great turning against socialism and communism and all of that, the Red Scare, the McCarthy period and all of that, we've had a society that has kind of swept all of that away as if it were either old-fashioned or evil or disloyal. And it's even gone to the point that we don't have a socialist party of any size or influence, the way every other industrial country in the world does. Not even to mention those where the Socialist Party are part of the government, like is the case today in Portugal or Germany, and so on. Americans are finally coming out of hibernation and recognizing that, as you put it, capitalism isn't the be-all and end-all, and a healthy society ought to be able to criticize what it has in the hopes of doing something better. The one thing that I think unites all socialists is the notion simply that we can do better than capitalism, and the effort to think that through and to figure out where it to go is worthwhile and part of what any healthy society these days ought to have. Having said that, socialism has meant different things to different people. If I wanted to judge capitalism, for example, would I pick as my example Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, boasts of its capitalist economy? Should I pick some other dictatorship in Latin America? For example, Bolsonaro, now in Brazil. What kind of society is that? He calls it a capitalist society, and so forth and so on. And the answer is no, that capitalism has different forms, and the same is true of socialism. Yes, there are things that socialism has that I don't want, that other socialists don't agree with. You find that in the Soviet Union, that there were things there that we can learn to do and things there that we can learn not to do. A balanced assessment of socialist experiments, Russia, China, Cuba, Denmark, Sweden, all of these give you things to follow, things to build on, and things to avoid like the plague. And a rational conversation, which is what we haven't had for the period of hibernation since the late 40s, a rational conversation would reopen that question, which is what the new and young generation of Americans is demanding. Take a look at socialism. It's the most developed alternative that capitalism has. It's the product of what people did who thought they could do better than capitalism. And it is simple human decency to take a look at what they've achieved in Denmark, in Scandinavia, also in Russia and China, to come up with whatever lessons there are for how we can move forward in the United States without imagining that we've come to the end of history, that capitalism is the only and best thing, and that anybody who thinks otherwise is somehow being disloyal.
Wouldn't it be useful to imagine, to visualize a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum is the government basically does nothing except run the army? That would be pure libertarianism. And at the other end of the spectrum is the government owns everything. It owns every business. It does all the manufacturing. It does all the, all the service industries, absolutely everything. In fact, even all private property, all housing. And on that end of the spectrum, you have the old Soviet Union. And on the government only has an army end of the spectrum. Well, that's never been successfully tried anywhere in the world. But you would have what the libertarians in the United States say, all capitalist countries should become. And then in the middle, what you have as you slide through the spectrum is a change in the definition of what is the appropriate role of government, and arguably what that means is what is the commons the government should administer. So, it could be that the commons should include jobs and housing and health care and education, like happens in Denmark, but doesn't happen here with any of those things. Although we've agreed that the commons for health care should extend to people who are over 65, but and in some states it extends to everyone. So and as we move that line across that spectrum from government doing nothing to government doing everything, we start hitting these different points that we call, unregulated capitalism, heavily regulated capitalism, capitalism with socialism, socialism without capitalism, all that kind of. Is that a reasonable way to think of it?
Absolutely. I would have two comments on that. One, that's what I mean by opening up a rational conversation. Let us ask, for example, if we have here in New York City where I live, we have a beautiful park in the middle of our city. It's called Central Park. It's really spectacular. Throughout its history, it's been a place where no fee is charged to enter. If you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter. If you want to share the beautiful space on a lovely afternoon with your family on a blanket and have a picnic, you do it, and you do it freely, and it's a way for the whole city to overcome many other kinds of divisions, to do something pleasurable together. And we think it's valuable, and nobody in their right mind, excepting a few libertarians perhaps, would suggest that we ought to make it a fee for service. We don't want that. We want it to be shared, like we do our public schools, like we do a whole lot of other things. And that would be a rational conversation. Should we have health care handled one way or the other? Public schools, transport. Kansas City just canceled all fees for public transport. This is a very interesting idea. Nobody says that's an evil thing to do. It's a reasonable conversation, pros and cons. So, yes, I think there's a continuum, and a society that isn't too frightened to ask these questions would pursue the answers, and I think make a better society than we have. But there's a second point. Not all socialists think, I'm one of them, that the government is the necessary and appropriate thing that ought to happen. We think that the whole debate between capitalism and socialism really hinges on a different issue. Not so much whether the government or the private sector does it. That should be decided, as I just said, in terms of what people want and how they want to enjoy life. For us, the question is, how do you organize the workplace, the factory, the office, the store? Do you have a small number of people at the top, the owner, the board of directors, making all the decisions? what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that, after all, everybody helped to produce. Do you have a few people doing that who are unaccountable to the vast majority of employees? Or do you make it a democratic institution where all the people have a say, all the stakeholders have a role to play? Socialism, for me, is bringing democracy to the workplace, to the economy, where it should have been all along, from which it has been excluded. And for me, that's the big change coming, not so much the debate over government versus private.
Well, and we just have a minute left. And also you could apply that spectrum there because, for example, you could argue that a union is democracy in the workplace or a co-op. I mean, you know, the co-op is one end of the spectrum, the union's at the other.
That's right. And I think, look, I think in a rational society, we would have a public debate and maybe even a public decision. What portion of the economy do we want to work as a co-op? How many of us want to work in a workplace which is democratic versus hierarchical? In order for us to have that debate and to make that decision, we have to have a worker co-op sector alongside our capitalist sector and let people see it and feel it and work in it and buy from it, and then let's make a decision rather than assuming that all of that has been historically settled and is nothing we ought to think about. That's self-repression of a fundamental issue, which is how we want the economy to serve us rather than us always adjusting to the economic system we have.